Any involvement of a foreign government in the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil is an unacceptable violation of our sovereignty.
Canada is accusing India of murdering a separatist leader. Relations between the two countries now frayed. What can we expect next? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Braun and Idu, and this is The Heat. In a shocking accusation, Canada claims the Indian government killed a Sikh separatist leader who is a Canadian citizen in British Columbia this past June. New Delhi denies the allegation, describing it as absurd. Both countries expelled diplomats in a tit-for-tat, and India is no longer issuing visas to Canadians, citing a lack of security for its diplomatic personnel in Canada.
You are aware of the security threats being faced by our High Commission and consulates in Canada. This has disrupted their normal functioning. Accordingly, our High Commission and consulates are temporarily unable to process visa applications.
So how will this affect relations between India and the West? To help us get some answers to that question, let's bring in our panelists. Here in Washington, D.C., Chidanand Rajghatta is foreign editor and U.S. bureau chief of the Times of India. Also here in D.C., Sourabh Gupta is a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy specialist for the Institute for China-America Studies. From Toronto, Aurel Braun is a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. And Yves Engler is a political activist and author joining us from Montreal. We want to welcome all of you to the broadcast. Chidanand, why don't I start with you? Last week, Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, he said he accused India of orchestrating an assassination of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. Of course, New Delhi denying this. Let's listen to what Trudeau had to say.
There are credible reasons to believe that agents of the government of India were involved in the killing of a Canadian on Canadian soil. And we call upon the government of India to engage with us to move forward on getting to the truth of this matter.
So as this controversy continues to swirl, give us a sense of what the feeling in India is right now.
Well, first of all, let me preface this by saying any country, and I repeat, any country that is found, involved in transnational or extra territorial killing should be held accountable. But that said, time and again, the Canadian Prime Minister has used the term credible allegations, and in the clip that you played, credible reasons. I find that ridiculous. I mean, why doesn't he use the word evidence? Why doesn't he say there is evidence, or we have presented evidence to the Indian government, and then we can talk from there? Instead, the whole thing now seems like a political ploy. He is dependent on, the Sikh constituency in Canada for his political survival. That we know through the numbers in Parliament. And he goes on repeating this credible allegations. And I think yesterday an Indian diplomat actually, smacked him back, saying there are credible rumors that there was, cocaine. I mean, I find the level of discourse really going down. But he said when Trudeau went to Delhi, and that's why he missed many of his G20 engagement. So, I mean, it does not behave the prime minister of a country to, hang this on the basis of credible allegations. I mean, a basic crime reporter would know. You produce evidence, you talk about evidence. And that's something the Canadian Prime Minister has not done, and I think that does great disservice to him. Even assuming, I mean, let's say, there was some, government fingerprint. You take that up through private channels, through diplomatic channels. India and Canada are not enemies. They are, responsible countries. They're democracies. You first engage the government. And the government of India has clearly said that no evidence has been presented to them. So I just find this whole thing very shifty. And to this day, it's now been more than, a week, 2 weeks. And there's still no talk of evidence. And understandably, the mood in New Delhi is angry. Because for almost 40 years now, the government of India, successive government cutting across party lines, have pointed out that Canada has been hosting this very marginal, violent separatists agitating for, so-called Khalistan, which does not have mainstream support in India, not even in the Punjab. I mean, remember, India had a Sikh prime minister for 10 years. So Khalistan is such a marginal issue, and for Canada to, play host to this violent separatists, and within Canada itself, there have been clashes between, the marginal violent separatist Sikhs and the moderate Sikhs. So, I mean, Canada really ought to re-examine its whole policy about, hosting these groups. Some of these groups have proved to be dangerous, as far back as the 1980s. Indira Gandhi, then Indian Prime Minister, asked for extradition and reining in of these Khalistani extremists, some of whom went on to blow up a plane, an Air India plane, in which 329 people were killed. Most of them were Canadian citizens. So I find this incredibly irresponsible on part of Canada, and I think the global opinion is now turning against Canada. There are very few takers for this whole idea of accusing India without presenting evidence and then hanging everything on the basis of credible allegation.
Okay, Chidanand, help our viewers to understand a little bit more about the victim. I mean, how is he being framed in India? This is a man who was gunned down. We do know that. How would you describe him?
Absolutely. In fact, if you go online, you'll see many jokes and memes about this guy, who was supposedly a plumber and a priest at the Gurdwara, but you'll also see footage on social media of him wielding weapons, and practicing at a shooting range. He was a wanted man. I'm not sure whether he was a terrorist, but he was definitely an extremist who espoused violent means, good for a priest. So, the joke is that if he is a plumber, then Osama bin Laden was a civil contractor. I mean, it's ludicrous. And you can see in Canada, in these separatist gurdwaras, there are posters asking for violent attacks against Indian diplomats, right? And Indian missions in San Francisco and, south of the border, because this constituency is in both sides of the border, this marginal Sikh, violent, separatist constituency. The Indian consulate was attacked in San Francisco twice. I mean, these are lunatics, and they're a very small, marginal bunch who do great disservice to a wonderful community, which is part of mainstream India. This is a community which constitutes only 2% of India's population, but they've given us some of the finest people, including a prime minister, Manmohan Singh, for 10 years. So the idea that the government of Canada takes such a lackadaisical approach to these loonies is, I mean, it's shocking. And they are finding out that, not just Indian opinion, but global opinion is turning against them. I think, Justin Trudeau used this as a political ploy to try and shore up. But
All right.
My sense is backfiring on it.
Okay, we're getting the point from you there. Aurel, the relationship between these two countries obviously strained. We've gotten the perspective from India rather. What's the perspective in Canada? How is it being viewed there?
It is viewed with considerable severity because, as the first speaker said initially, that if this was an extrajudicial killing, extraterritorial killing, that is a violation of international law, that is a violation of Canadian sovereignty. And the speaker that you had on talked about parsing terms, whether it was allegation or evidence. In fact, the Five Eyes Alliance suggested that there is evidence, that the American ambassador said that they provided some of that evidence to Canada. The question here is whether that evidence is incontrovertible, that the timing is important. The relationship with India is really badly damaged. So there are questions as to whether there is sufficient evidence, whether that evidence is incontrovertible, whether there will be enough transparency, whether this may have been done differently. And I think that would be the most helpful way to do it, that these two democracies, Canada and India, would try to work this thing out. And perhaps it wasn't the wiser decision to come out publicly before all the evidence matured, but this is not to say that there are no concerns that are legitimate.
Yves, India's government saying the accusation absurd. Some believe that Trudeau's basically pandering to the Sikh population in the country. It's the largest outside of Punjab state in India. In fact, a quarter of the population in Surrey, where the victim lived, are Sikh, and there's 770,000 of them living in Canada. Is there a political calculation at play here?
There could be, but I think the political calculation is more in the other direction. That's why I generally do not have much trust in the intelligence agency or the police, intelligence agencies or police in Canada. But in this case, I actually have put more weight into what they're saying because the Canadian government, and specifically the Five Eyes and the intelligence agencies, have been pushing a very narrow foreign interference, which is basically China is interfering in Canada. We have to be scared of China, and it's a justification to ratchet up tensions with China. And also, part of that is having India as a counterweight to China. And Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, which came out about a year ago, is very clear, it's very anti-China, and it's based a large part on deepening ties with India. So the political argument, yes, there is a narrow electoralist Sikh community dynamic that would contribute to the thinking of the government, no doubt. But I think at a bigger geopolitical level, the Canadian government wants to deepen ties with India, wants a free trade agreement, which has now been postponed, and a whole bunch of other deepening of ties. So I don't buy it. I buy that. I agree that we shouldn't, pass judgment until more evidence is in the public domain. But just today, the leader of the opposition, or the third party, the NDP, he saw the private intelligence, and he says it points to India's involvement. The Canadian government intelligence agency is saying they caught wiretapping of Indian officials talking about it. I totally presume the Canadian intelligence agencies do wiretap all the different governments, do monitor their communications. So I think I think it's very likely that this is what happened and what Trudeau is saying. And also we have to be clear that the Canadian government sent its national security advisor to India on 2 different occasions earlier in the summer after the assassination to raise this issue with India. And then Trudeau says he raised it with Modi himself when he was there during the G20. At some point, if maybe it's not 100% certain that Indian government was involved, but if they have pretty credible evidence, it's a pretty big deal for a government to be assassinating political dissidents that are citizens of another country on their soil. So I think the Canadian government, and I'm very critical of the Trudeau government, I think on this issue, I tend to align with what Trudeau has done so far.
Sourabh, you're one of these guys who looks at the geopolitical landscape very closely. What do you make of it?
What I make of it is that at the end of the day, all that's going to happen is there's going to be a slap on the wrist of the Indians. Canada came out with its Indo-Pacific strategy last year, which was very anti-Chinese, but it was then couched in a lot of other multilateralist talk, and India really didn't have a figure prominently in that strategy. So Canada-India relations, I mean, there are a lot of people-to-people ties, but it's really not going any great distance as such. And Canada is one of the lesser Five Eyes players, frankly, in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, think of it. You have AUKUS, which has the United Kingdom, no Canada there, and of course the Australians and New Zealand are in a big way in the Indo-Pacific, and the US too. Canada really is not so engaged. So India-Canada ties in terms of the geopolitics was not much to talk about in any case. With regard to what has transpired, I think this is, unfortunately, the Modi government going one step beyond what it should be going. Mr. Modi's government has taken brave decisions in terms of deepening relations and has moved beyond what it calls hesitations of history, but it's also, there's an ugly tone to it in certain deeds. We're talking about an assassination, and people have talked of the gravity of it. But also, India is facing charges at a permanent court of arbitration on a separate issue with Pakistan. And there are really ugly things being said by the Modi government about a so-called court and blah, 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 denigrating things, which calls into question how its adherence to international law at a time when India has a fairly good standing in the eyes of international law. But all said and done, I mean, the main player in this, in terms of the geopolitics, is the United States, and in terms of its relationship with India. And frankly, when the US needs somebody on its side in terms of the geopolitics, it knows how to overlook issues and mete out slaps on the wrist and move forward. And that's essentially at the end of the day, regardless of whether investigation goes, how the geopolitics of the matter will play out.
Well, Chidanand, India is growing in international clout. It's part of the BRICS. It's part of the Quad. It has good relations with the U.S. and Russia. So it just hosted the G20 as well. Is this going to damage its image on the world stage?
Well, if there is evidence, and again, let me point out, the word evidence has not been used at all by any of Canada's rulers, prime minister, or his party people, his aides. It's still credible allegations. Yes, if there is evidence, yeah, sure. But even otherwise, look, the fundamental fact here is that Canada has drawn attention to the fact that it has played host to terrorists and extremists who have been damaging not just India, but Canada itself. Anybody who has an idea of the background to this whole story knows that for nearly 40 years, Canada, and particularly British Columbia, the Surrey-Vancouver area, has been the site of clashes between moderate Sikhs and extremist Sikhs. This is a wonderful community that has ennobled Canada, and they really need to be honored and appreciated. The British Columbia had a Sikh premier going back, I think, 22 years, Ujjal Dosanjh. These extremists, Sikh extremists, the Khalistani proponents, beat up Ujjal Dosanjh. Literally, physically, they beat him up. So this tension goes back a long way. And the Khalistanis are really marginal, and the fact that Canada has not, acted against them does, disservice to their national governments. So I don't believe in this idea of India being slapped on the wrist or wrapped on the wrist. If anything, Canada slapped itself on its face. The other thing is all this talk of rules-based international order, adherence to international order. The United States should be the last country to talk about international order and following international law. I mean there's countless examples. I mean, you want to talk about transnational assassinations? The United States assassinated its own citizen, Anwar Awlaki. How many remember that? Okay, in Yemen, he was killed by a drone strike. This is a man who was born in New Mexico. Not just him. A week later, his son, 16-year-old, killed. 6 years later, his daughter, 8 years old, killed. Right? So, I mean, to hear all these pious pronouncements coming from, United States or Canada about rules-based order, adherence to international law, oh, yeah, right. I mean, we have seen all this before. The rule should apply to everybody, not just to India or, China or Pakistan. The global order should be fair to everybody, and this is not fair. And you want to hammer a country on the basis of credible allegations? I mean, you just draw attention, to your own, misgovernance and what you have done over the years. Speaking of political angle, one of my predecessors said, well, there's a bit of politics in. You bet there is politics in why Justin Trudeau did this. And I'll give you one very stark example. Last year, there was a farmers' agitation going on in India. Justin Trudeau came out in support of the farmers, striking farmers. He had no business. That's interference in another country's internal affairs. I mean, that's like India, supporting truckers. Or parents, agitating right now against, LGBTQ issues. So, I mean, I think Trudeau now has a well-established record of pandering to this small constituency for his political survival, and this whole episode has drawn attention to that too. If India is, involved in it, produce the evidence, take it up in whatever forum, and first of all, prosecute the guys, who are there in Canada who may have done this. They haven't even arrested the two guys who were supposed to have shot this so-called plumber. So
right.
When you even have a basic arrest, there's no law enforcement mechanism which is kicked into, work.
All right.
And you're already, global and accusing another country of being responsible.
Okay.
That doesn't.
I think we got your point there, Yves. Let me kind of piggyback off what he was talking about. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken had some comments on this. So let's roll the tape, and I want to get your reaction on the other side.
We are extremely vigilant about any instances of alleged transnational repression. Something we take very, very seriously. And I think it's important more broadly for the international system that any country that might consider engaging in such acts not do so.
So, you know, Chidanand makes a point here. I mean, what about the U.S. Killing Osama bin Laden in Pakistan or targeting Iranian General Soleimani in Iraq? He does sort of have a point that they're very good at these pronouncements, not necessarily that they adhere to them.
Oh, I agree completely. I would go a step further, and I would say the Canadian government is either silent and in some cases actually celebrated these American assassinations. So I completely agree. The Canadian government's talk of an international rules-based order is complete, utter hypocrisy. The Canadian government with Israel's assassinations. I mean, the Canadian government for a long time was turning a blind eye that Israel was using, Mossad was using Canadian passports when they tried to kill the head of Hamas in '97, and there was the killing, a mistaken killing in Norway in '73. So no, I completely agree that the Canadian government's discussion, you know, the moral outrage about, you know, foreign assassinations is hypocritical. I don't think it's a good thing, though. I don't think that we want to be moving towards a world where, you know, powerful countries, be that the main hegemon, the U.S., you know, do these things around the world, or, you know, lesser powers like India, or for that matter, Canada. So the U.S. is, you know, totally hypocritical, no doubt.
Sourabh Gupta, an opinion piece published in the Middle East Eye compares India now with Israel. It says that India now is so important geopolitically to the West that assassinations in a foreign land may be overlooked due to its strategic significance. And we've seen this in the past with the United States. During the Trump administration, Jamal Khashoggi killed in Turkey in 2018 by agents from the Saudi government. And, you know, to your point about the slap in the wrist, do you see the political dimension there, the geopolitics playing into all of this? You mentioned a slap on the wrist. I mean, what more do you expect from the United States government?
Slap on the wrist. I don't know where they'll go with this. They'll have some strong language. They will try to have somebody from the Indian end, perhaps someone lower down within the system, extradited. I don't think they will. Such a event will happen. But it gets back to that same point. I mean, for me, because of that Israel connection itself, India is almost as important as Israel in some respects in U.S. foreign policy. And just like Israel got away with killing people in the United Arab Emirates, Hezbollah people, or whoever, wherever, and really nothing was brought to bear on the Israelis. I mean, that's why I sense, I mean, nothing will be brought to bear on the Indians materially in this instance. This might be an occasion, though, for the U.S. to talk to both sides in terms of it's unacceptable to do these things, and to the Canadians also, to the little bit of too much of vote bank politics and ethnic minority politics, and how that has, in the larger scheme of things, hurting Canada's geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific, because it's not with this killing that suddenly this has mushroomed. I mean, the Indian government has for quite a long time been after the Canadians to clamp down on these sort of activities, and particularly fundraising for violent separatist Khalistani groups. But my bottom line, again, I will come back to what I did say previously. It's easy to say about the United States doing these things, and I mean, it has done these things flagrantly. I mean, Soleimani being probably the most prominent one, assassinated in a third country, Iraq. And when the Iraqis wanted to kick the troops out, America threatened that we will hold up your foreign currency reserves at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. But my point out here is U.S. is an outlier in these sort of actions. Nobody else does it. Not Australia, not Japan, none of the other G7 countries goes about doing these sort of actions. And so one can easily conflate it. Oh, the U.S. did, that means the West does it. No, they don't do it. Only the United States does it. And any self-respecting government should not be engaging in these sort of activities. And I think that's where the rules-bound order comes in. And let's be more rules-bound in these regards, and not not get down to doing these sort of activities.
Aurel, we're seeing both sides really digging in on this, and you're hearing leaders in India suggesting that Canada needs to pay attention to New Delhi's concerns. Let's listen to what the Indian foreign minister had to say on this.
In the last few years, Canada actually has seen a lot of organized crime, relating to, the secessionist forces, organized crime, violence, extremism. They're all very, very deeply mixed up. We've given them a lot of information about organized crime leadership, which operates out of Canada.
Aurel, what are your thoughts on what he had to say there?
It's a classic diversionary tactic. Don't look here, look elsewhere. This is not where the problem is. And I'm afraid I have to say this about what Mr. Rajghatta said, what Mr. Engler said, that this kind of whataboutism is not helpful in terms of understanding how international law is supposed to work out and how this particular case ought to be resolved. We need to focus on this matter. If the evidence is there, then I think this is a very serious action. And when we have Mr. Rajghatta flinging all these allegations against Canada, it's not particularly helpful. Canada is a country where the rule of law is pretty strong. It's not perfect. No democracy is perfect. We can always talk policies, but it's another thing to justify this kind of action. So we have to make up our minds. Is this justified in international law or not? And I thought at the beginning, we began with the idea that it wasn't justified. It's whether the evidence will bear it out. Now, if there is that evidence, will India suffer more than a slap on the wrist? Well, that's another matter, because this is where geopolitics come up against international law. And unfortunately, in the 21st century, what we see is that geopolitics still remain prime.
Chidanand, we're just about out of time. I want to give you about 20 seconds just to respond to what he had to say.
Like I said, evidence, show them the evidence if you have the evidence. I find it incredible that the Prime Minister of Canada still has not used the word evidence. We are talking of evidence. He's not talking about evidence. He's still talking about credible allegations. I prefaced my whole remark by saying, if India is involved, or if any country for that matter, in transnational assassinations, that is wrong, that they should be held to account. And it's not whataboutism to point out that the United States has not been held to account.
All right.
Again, Bin Laden and Soleimani.
Chidanand, as I said, we've run out of time. I apologize. I'm going to have to cut you off. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your insights as well as the others. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.